Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Baumer Conversation. It's February 10th, 2021, and I'm John Davis. Our guest tonight is Andrew Sargeant. He's a landscape designer and currently the Rose Fellow Landscape Architect at Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, a community development funding intermediary working towards community revitalization in Greater Cleveland. His work there is a fascinating use of environmental measurement and data analysis in the service of equity, sustainability, and empowerment of local communities. Drew is a pioneering force in the critical use of various design technologies to push the boundaries of landscape design. He is also a founding member and vice president of the Urban Studio, an interdisciplinary art and design collaborative based in DC and LA. He has held positions at Olin and was the Olmsted Fellow at the Landscape Architecture Foundation. His degree in landscape architecture is from Temple University. We're very excited to have him with us tonight. Thank you, Drew, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Just like John mentioned, I've recently started a fellowship with the Enterprise Foundation called the Rose Architectural Fellowship, which I'm the first landscape architect to be involved in. A lot of the work that I've been doing in Cleveland thus far has kind of followed a trend in my career. I've been doing a lot of, I would say, landscape architectural research in technology since the start of my career. So this presentation is going to talk about something that I like to coin, the landscape singularity. And the singularity is kind of this sci-fi moment in which, artificial intelligence and other technologies have become so advanced that humanity undergoes dramatic and irreversible change. And I believe, if we don't focus so much on the phrase artificial intelligence, we've kind of already hit that point. Technology is at a point right now where, human beings will never really be the same again. I think that has a unique play, again, in the field of landscape architecture and urban design. So, starting at my time at Olin, working as a BIM manager there and getting introduced to building information modeling, and then continuing and more recently my time in Austin with the firm Lionheart doing parametric modeling for construction documentation. I think technology has kind of been a through line through my career, using it to really do iterative design processes, but then also, probing and asking questions, which is a lot of what I've been doing thus far in the fellowship at CNP. So when I first joined CNP, it was kind of the question of what technologies will I be using, because this is generally outside the normal role of a landscape architect within private practice. There's no other designers on staff. I function as kind of a sole designer. So they had asked me, how can human-centered and urban design landscape architecture strategies be employed to empower communities to achieve equity and resilience? It's kind of the probe of the fellowship. And I've kind of thought, again, it's almost everything. And how can we use landscape architecture strategies to empower communities to achieve equity and resilience? We'd have to throw everything at it. So in my sense, it's, changing that strategies to landscape architecture technologies. So thus far, I've kind of, thrown my entire wheelhouse at it, and some new skills that I picked up along the way in these first couple of months, some things that I haven't been used to doing in the past. So specifically, I'll talk about one project today and how I've been using GIS and parametric modeling to do this work. So before I jump into that material, just some brief background on the site. This is an old depiction of the Kingsbury Site, which is about an 80 to 90 acre parcel within Greater Cleveland. And this is a shot of the 1850s. Well, before Industrial Revolution, we had clear sight lines and water access and thus forth in Cleveland. But moving forward, Industrial Revolution shaped and continues to shape, or I would say the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution continues to shape how Cleveland interacts with natural land, especially water. You can see the Cuyahoga River there, and how industry basically pushed that settlement that you saw in the prior picture outwards away from the river. And then moving towards the Great Depression, we started to see some of the social the social influences of that as well. You know, working class people were out of jobs, and a lot of the poor people or people without jobs started to move into this area, and it quickly became kind of a landfill, a dumping ground, if you will, by the 1930s. But you know, a watershed moment for our discipline and other disciplines in 1969, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire, and subsequently was the birth of the EPA. But at that same time, in roughly maybe a half-mile boundary, this site was continued to be used for dumping and dereliction well into the 1960s. And then, some other things happened. Public housing started to become, a big thing happening within our country, and around this site was no different. So, Garden Valley Homes is one of I think the most prominent public housing developments in the nation at the time, directly south of our site. But you can see the folks in this photograph; they were, subject to some of the worst kind of land use adjacencies at the time, being directly adjacent to industrial land use and not a lot of open space. Again, moving throughout time, there was a number of racial tensions within Cleveland and across the nation that kind of exacerbated some of the previous derelictions that I've talked about, leading to blight within some of these neighborhoods done by vigilantism and so forth. And this is particularly interesting when it comes to our site because of one specific element within the site called the Sideway Bridge, which was set on fire by a vigilante during that time, never brought to justice. But what that did was, create what used to be a 10-minute walk for school children into a mile to circumvent the grade change within the site, about, turning like I said, been a 10-minute walk into almost a half an hour kind of trek for kids to cross from neighborhood to neighborhood. And when I started to look at this site for CNP, one of the things that was really interesting to me, again, with the lens of, poverty, but then also, ecological stability. This is one of the sites, few in Cleveland, where you have a really mature tree canopy. You can see from this picture, almost, growing up to the side of the bridge. Very few urban contexts have such tree canopy. So it's a real kind of gem within the city and ripe for redevelopment. So again, talking about GIS, parametric modeling, and how I can use that to kind of sculpt a narrative for reinvestment within the city and really map inequity. And I'm just going to talk through about some of the data that I'm pulling into this model, and then jump into some live demonstration of the data points. Cuyahoga open data, free available data. Most municipalities have data you can just download. We're going to be looking at property use and environmental data, the EPA Environmental Atlas, looking at land use for forested areas, access to parks, and thus forth. And lastly, a tree canopy assessment done by funded by CNP in 2017. So I'm going to jump out of here. And I would say one thing that's been kind of an inspiration of mine, I would say, for students to definitely check out, is the New York Times, maybe not necessarily associated with landscape architecture practices, but their visualization techniques are always top notch. And I think one thing I would say to students is the idea of expression is comprehension. So being able to express ideas and concepts fluidly means that you understand them. This goes from your concept designs, but then also down to diagramming and final designs as well. Just some examples of things that I'm inspired by when I'm doing some of this data modeling and creating some of these visuals. So I'm going to jump into kind of Rhino to kind of show you how I generally kind of work around in the space. Generally in plan view, and in perspective at the same time. So what you're seeing is a half-mile boundary around the site. And then if I zoom out, you're going to see the greater Cleveland area. What you're seeing mapped right now is percent of people living in each of these highlighted polygons, which are block groups, for being 2 times below the poverty rate. So you can see in our area, we have a concentration of poverty in our project area. We have, 2 block groups with folks living in 87% of the people living in this area being 2 times under the poverty rate, and a whopping 98%, almost 100% of these folks in this area living living under 2 times the poverty rate. One of the things that, as landscape architects we can do is try to, again, maybe humanize this kind of data. So we're looking at raw numbers. It doesn't really hit you that much. So what the EPA Environmental Atlas does is also give the amount of people living in this area. And if I take the percentage that you're seeing, 98% versus the actual population, we can start to see what that really looks like. And just like you would see in New York Times graphic, we can start to see concentrations of poverty at a more realistic level. These are actual people within the city of Cleveland. And the darker the spots, the more concentrated the poverty level is. And what this allows us to do is look for some correlation. So for instance, in this area, we're seeing maybe a 12% increase in number of people living in poverty. But I mean, look at the amount of people though, so if I didn't have this layer turned on, we're kind of blind to that. We're looking at, 87%, 98%. We're like, oh, these are pretty comparable. But in hindsight, when you turn on the actual layer of who's living there, we're seeing that these people, there's a large number of people here living in poverty. And then again, what I'd like to do is, we keep doing data analysis. We keep the folks, the individuals represented. We keep that in the back of our mind. These dots are people living in poverty, and then we can start to look at different factors in regards to healthcare. So I'm going to just turn those layers on real quickly, if you allow me. And John, I know we got to save some time for discussion, but I want to be conscious of that before I keep going. So what I've just turned on is, again, associated costs for healthcare. So we're still seeing the dots of folks living in poverty, previously displayed, but now we're seeing associated costs of healthcare. And this is associated costs for O3 concentration for missed school days. So the EPA has collected data that says, for students missing school days, here's the associated cost. So we're seeing not only is there a concentrated pocket of poverty here, these people are paying even more in associated costs with healthcare. Almost 10 times the percent, or 10 times the cost of their neighbors within a half-mile radius. And a reminder that a half-mile radius is a 10-minute walk. So less than 5 minutes away, these people are paying 10 times the amount of cost in associated healthcare, but then are living by lower means. Significant problem there. And where landscape architects really come into play, these healthcare costs, again, are associated with high pollutants in the air. One of the things that landscape architects talk about all the time, and again, why this site is so important, again, is urban tree canopy. So if you give me one moment, I'm just going to turn on the open space boundaries so you can better see our site. Oops, let's see. It's not going to show us the full plan. Let's turn on residential. And I'm just going to turn on some. Let's see what happens when it's more live. Let's see, I'm missing something. I'll turn on just the green space then. Sorry about that. We're not going to see the full picture of our site, but our site is located right here. It extends a little bit up here. Cleveland is not necessarily calling this a green space because it's not programmed, but there's significant tree canopy there. And we'll see that when I turn the tree canopy layer on. So like I said, our site is still in this boundary, and majority of that is located in here. And if I turn back on the residential use, we can start to zoom in and then make some inferences here. So again, these black dots that you're seeing here are individual people living under 2 times the poverty rate. And then we're seeing the associated costs with healthcare on top of that, the $20 right there. We can see that majority of the tree canopy is actually in an area where most of the people don't live. So that could be, again, an inference for one of the reasons why the healthcare cost is significantly lower. We can see, look at this abundant tree canopy here, again, where our site is located, and folks are paying, you know, way less for associated healthcare costs. And if we zoom in to where it looks like, again, you know, multifamily development down here, much larger building footprints as opposed to maybe some single family in here, we see almost no tree canopy down here. So we can make some inferences, probably for, you know, a more examined study down the road, but make some inferences saying that, you know, majority of the people living here under the poverty rate without associated healthy tree canopy are subject to, you know, higher healthcare costs. And these are just one of the things that, you know, we can look at when we're talking about data points. We could start to bring, again, zoning and land use in here. And a lot of this data, again, that I have in here is mapped to the actual individual building. So again, one of the things that I've mentioned in kind of the history of the site is that Cleveland's you know, long history with industrial land use. So what you're seeing right here, you know, a large concentration, and maybe I'll turn a little bit of the data off to make it easier to see. Let's turn off the folks. What you're seeing here, majority of the land use in regards to, you know, building footprint is associated with either residential or industrial use. And it still exists like that today. So in most of the areas where, and if I turn into that percent poverty back on. Try to see the association with land use for folks living in poverty as well. One of the things that in cities like Cleveland, where, you know, that industrial land use has left, a lot of the remnants of it are still remain. So in areas where you have, you know, these large artifacts of, you know, large architectural infrastructure that is tied to one land use, we're still seeing, you know, a large amount of associated poverty. So what we're seeing, if we look at our site right here, there's little to no commercial land use in our area. So how do we try to involve jobs from a planning perspective that can be maybe leverage some of these existing infrastructures, but, you know, start to inform a different type of planning model that says, hey, you know, industrial revolution is the thing of the past. We can't seem to escape the conditions that these people are living in if we don't change it from that perspective as well. Start to introduce, you know, either mixed use or commercial land use in this area and get rid of this saturation of industrial land use that's in here. That could also be leading to some of these exacerbated healthcare costs as well. John, are we good on time? Could I keep going? Okay. All right. So I'm gonna, and like I said, all the data that you're seeing that I'm modeling in here is publicly available, and for students who are familiar with Grasshopper, this is what kind of under the hood looks like. Basically, I have a kind of control point here in which I'm turning visibility and graphics off. Everything is generally organized in here. I've been tinkering around with it recently, so you're seeing maybe some unorganization in here. But one thing we can also drill down, talking about maybe not the site level, is again how that canopy can be improved on at the city level. So I'm going to turn some of this stuff on. Okay. Okay. So now we're looking at the urban tree canopy study for the entire city. And let's zoom out a little bit. Okay. So what the urban tree canopy study that CNP funded in 2017 allowed us to look at is, how can we improve some of the conditions that that I talked about in some of the previous examples by looking at an assessment of tree canopy across the entire city. So in the areas that we're looking at in particular, we can see that this is looking at total land use. So we have about 1,500 acres of total land use in this area, 1,000 acres and maybe 790 acres down here. So we can start to kind of, again, toggle some of these things on, and the color grading will continue to update as we toggle these things on. So what we'll look at next is possible area for additional tree canopy. So we're looking at these areas in red, not doing so good. We only have 568 acres for possible additional tree canopy here, 879 acres here. So this is looking pretty great. So we can improve maybe some healthcare costs associated with lack of tree canopy in this neighborhood. And then looking at the minutia of, could we vegetated versus impervious area for additional tree canopy. Things start to look a little bit better when you start to delve in some of the specifics. So, in most of the area for additional tree canopy in this area, most of it is already vegetated. We're talking about maybe potential parks that are underutilized or underserved. So we have, almost a quarter of the possible additional area for tree canopy in the surrounding area of our site that's already vegetated. Let's look at some other things. When we're looking at, areas that are not suitable for tree canopy, and I'm going to try to turn on our industrial area again. Turn on industry. It might be a little bit tough to see, but areas where, again, we have significant amount of industrial land use could possibly lead to one of the reasons why we're not having, the ability to plant tree canopy there. So, one of the things that is unique about the opportunity of the fellowship is doing some of this kind of preemptive work before we dive into site details. And I'll be kind of talking to John about that, is how do we tell a narrative before we even jump into, site details and designs that can lead to actual investment, but then also, public advocacy work, getting the community involved about things that actually matter to them. How do we, get rid of poverty levels within their community? How do we improve air quality within their community? And how do we tie that to actual landscape architecture improvements? I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and jump into the conversation with John.
Great, thank you so much. Really fascinating, especially the kind of on-the-fly demonstration of the technology, which I very much appreciate. So I think my first question will be about that. There's to people outside of the design field, Rhino and Grasshopper are kind of like almost like a form of magic, right? Or they don't really understand they haven't spent hours and hours and hours working in these programs to know them like the back of their hands. So I'm curious about how effective you found communicating to stakeholders in these kinds of projects using the high-tech tools. What are the ways that you make use or leverage the technology in order to kind of have an impact on the people you're talking with?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is still internal at this point with folks who are maybe versed in it at the office at CNP. But I think, again, one of the reasons why I showed the New York Times example is that is the goal, is to get to, visualizations that are palatable, that could be in your newspaper. I think one of the things that maybe is a fault of design school and how maybe we teach these days is looking at things that are maybe only palatable or digestible for designers. So while it's kind of, it's available for these live demonstrations for folks that are on the call that, might understand it more, the end goal is to turn it into more digestible, maybe specific content for the lay public or just the general public. So I think, looking at examples like the New York Times or other, graphic simulations is going to be key for when we start to have those conversations with folks that are not versed in design.
So I'm glad we kind of went back to talking about the New York Times, because I find that to be really intriguing. This idea that landscape architecture shares or could share a common pathway with journalism in the future, or that seems to be an important part of your argument. And before I turn that into a question, I do want to remind our viewers that the comments are open on the YouTube channel, so you can ask questions or pose comments in YouTube, and they will make their way to this conversation. We'll be able to ask Drew some questions in real time. So please do that. But to go back to the question about the New York Times. So landscape architecture, don't necessarily think that when you go to school to become a landscape architect that you're going to have to like do journalism in a kind of way. But I'm curious about like what the kind of affinities that you see in that. Like, are there professional responsibilities to informing the public that you see as a key part of being a landscape architect?
100%. I think it's maybe a call to arms from the events of last year with kind of social upheaval after George Floyd's death, shedding some light on some things that have been happening for centuries. So I think there's been some talk about how does the profession move forward and actually make some change in these arenas. And I think one of the things that the profession has not done, but could help it make change in these arenas, is actually doing some advocacy work and, lining what is the goals and objectives of the profession with people's values. So, we're seeing, a new value system in Americans, especially with younger folks, in their response to, climate change and social justice. How can landscape architects, these are things that we care about and think that we can help solve or at least make a change in. How do we make that example clear as day, that this is a profession that not only does this, but potentially that you can get involved in too, especially talking to younger kids, especially if within their community they're dealing with some of these these things, in regards to environmental justice and social justice. It's one of the things that the Urban Studio specifically focuses on with our youth groups and youth programs is trying to really make it clear, like if you are in a community that has been historically disenfranchised, not only these are the things that you can use as a toolkit to recognize it, to just, maybe you walk down the sidewalk, you didn't even know it, but giving you the mindset and the toolkit of a landscape architect, you can start to see these things differently. And then, if you're, when you become of age and if you feel so inclined, you can go on and pursue a career within landscape architecture and possibly make some change in your community using that as a vehicle.
Yeah, I think that's like, that really hits it on the head. The idea that there's a mindset and an efficacy that's available to you, but no matter what neighborhood you may grow up in, a lot of people just have no idea that the career path of a landscape architect is kind of available as someone who can actually change to that. So I'm curious to hear more about the outreach work with kids specifically. Like, how old are they? What? How do you find them? How do you get them intrigued? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the Urban Studio specifically focuses on 16 plus students, so kids who are in their last 2 years of high school. ASLA does a really good job in kind of doing the K through 12, trying to get kids in elementary school. What we try to focus on is how can we actually get kids who are right on that cusp of making a decision to go to college, to lean towards fields like landscape architecture, engineering, and so forth. And our programs we run programs based in DC and in LA. In LA, the programs have been kind of more akin to art and placemaking, while in DC there's been a stormwater component. All the programs are subsidized, so we go through grant funding, so we actually pay the kids to participate, so we're not just like, hey, volunteer your time and learn about some stuff. They're actually getting compensated to do so. And subsequently, on our board, we actually have a student member, Jelani, who was a participant in the first Studio DC workshop, and he continues to work with us to basically give his lens as a student. What are high school students looking for in our workshops, and how can we be more effective in that way?
That's fascinating to hear about, especially the treating a student who wants to learn more about something as that they're doing work and they should be compensated for doing that work. That's tremendous. That's really, really fantastic. I had never heard of that before, and
it's actually something that we think about in our community engagement as well too. One of our values is experts of lived experience. So folks, community members that could be integral to design processes should be compensated for that. They bring a wealth of expertise, and if you're asking people to volunteer their time and essentially be designers along with you, co-designers along with you, they should be compensated for that as well.
So I'm going to shift here. I've gotten some questions in from the YouTube chat, and I'll remind the audience again, please do put your comments or your questions in, and we will get them into the conversation here. I'm going to kind of paraphrase two of the comments which are related, and they're about technology, which I think is a big part of your work, and I think a big part of this conversation could kind of cover your thoughts about it, because it's obviously you've been thinking deeply about this for a long time. So the two questions from students Molly McCann and Ryan Vondren are about specific computational techniques. They want to know, is there in that kind of peek under the hood more than just representation? Are there kind of regression analyses happening? Are you running kind of more hardcore computation on them, and kind of where did that interest come from? How did you find yourself with this desire to crunch the numbers as well as be a designer who focuses on very visual aspects of the work?
Yeah, I would say not yet, not the kind of almost autonomous approach to the computational design. I think one of the things that I may be weary of in regards to all technology in regards to design work is that I'm not a proponent of completely stepping away as a designer. I think these are all tools. So in the essence that, I'm using these tools to look at correlations, and I'm using my design sensibilities to really steer the technology or use the technology in a specific way. I think, that's a big conversation about tech at large, is like, who's making the algorithms, and I think, you have to bring your design sensibilities to the technology. The technology is not king. Like, I'm just showing you, tricks and things like that. But the reason why it might be, eye-catching or maybe interesting is because I'm looking for specific things. So I'm pulling specific data sets. I'm color code, like, there's something about what I'm doing as a designer that's making the technology kind of work in itself. And I think in regards to, maybe not just the computational stuff, but, my interest in technologies as a whole, I've thought about it recently. I think it probably started in high school with, like, I was in high school when the first iPhone came out. And like, that was this game changer, still is a game changer. If you really want to trace back Apple's like rise to like everything, it's with that first iPhone. And I used to jailbreak iPhones for money. Like, I used to, like, you could follow YouTube videos back in the day to figure out how to do that stuff, but people used to pay me to jailbreak their iPhones and get them free apps. So you started, like, as I would say maybe innocent way of learning how to, do some troubleshooting and software hacks back when I was younger.
I think that's fascinating. The idea of it brings us back to kind of one of the points that you raised earlier, which is a criticism of the way that designers get trained. And I think that, and I can see this in your work, there's a lot of self autodidacticism, like, you taught yourself how to do things, and that there's an idea of, well, we're just going to figure this out, and I'm not going to be necessarily beholden to the guardrails that are set up by the profession or by expectations for what the professions should be. Do you think that kind of maybe entrepreneurial way of approaching how do you learn how to be a designer is valuable, and how might that show up in schools? How might that show up in programs?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I think it's going to be valuable no matter what you're doing. But I think, having an entrepreneurial mindset. But I think definitely in design, especially in the place where we are right now, because I think, again, people are looking for new ways to practice, especially in regards to some of these issues, social justice, environmental justice, and so forth, that haven't been maybe at the forefront of, of landscape architecture's attention in the past. And I think, how do you get it in school? I was actually, I guess a juror, if you will, for a class that they had at Harvard. And I don't want to butcher the name of the class. It was called, it was like Design Your Own Studio or something like that. So students had to design their own practice. And I wish that was something that I had in school. Essentially, like, what is your like mission? And how do you do it? How does your office run? And so forth. And I think getting students to maybe think, even if they don't go and run their own practice, but getting students to put down on paper the things that are important to them in terms of why they want to pursue a career in landscape architecture with that lens is a way to start. And I think, I've been fortunate enough, again, to have like the perseverance to like learn it myself. But I think we have to do a lot better to kind of create the knowledge sharing that should be available to everyone. It's one of the things that as co-chair of the digital technology PPN and ASLA were working to do. So, more webinars, more working groups, more cross-pollination with designers and landscape architects in regards to technology. So a lot of that work is still in the weeds, but hopefully will be available relatively soon.
Mm-hmm. So this leads me to another technologically related question, which is what do you think about the kind of the tyranny of the particular programs that are available to the design profession and how they may constrain certain practices? And I think Rhino and McNeil are they're known for being kind of renegades and doing their own thing, but the bigger programs like the Autodesk suites that just dominate the construction industry.
Yeah.
If there was a way that you could, from your perspective as a kind of a jailbreaker and a landscape architect, push the software industry that would serve landscape architects or maybe the design professions better, I'm curious about how you would push them or what you would like to see.
So that's the first thing we'd have to do is make sure that people care about us first. We're small discipline, and we'd have to focus on the advocacy and efficacy piece first. So before you jump up and say like, "Hey, do this for me," people are gonna be like, "Why?" So like I think let's do the first piece that I was talking about again, being considered when people are talking about some of these big changes, like, oh, we need landscape architects. Like once that becomes part of the conversation, maybe you have a little bit more of a standing in some of these changes in regards to software and things like that. But there's a big push right now. Architects are not even happy with Autodesk, and they control majority of their revenue stream. So there's a big push right now in kind of open source program and software. Maybe a little bit slower on the construction documentation side of things, but like I don't use Esri or ArcGIS. I use QGIS. It's free. It's open source. There's a number of plugins, tutorials available for it. So that might be again a precursor to what could happen to other things that align. So even with like the Adobe tools, like I still use Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop, but I've been using Figma a lot more, which is another free tool to start laying out boards and things like that. So there's a push on the side of open source tools, but one of the things that's maybe not going to make it easier for folks to make that switch is that you're going to have to learn something new. For me, it's not that big of a deal, but like, for existing offices and infrastructures, it's like, it's going to be costly to make that jump. So I think the power in changing the discipline from that point of view is going to stand with the younger crowd of folks that are still learning and have the capacity to learn more, to kind of challenge themselves, and break the mold in a lot of those regards.
Do you think that there's ever going to be a popular design tool that is really designed by a landscape architect? Or do you think that there will always be the kind of a barrier to that in terms of specialization of the software industry, et cetera? Or do you see open source as maybe the promise for greater specialization or greater kind of democratization of it?
I would say open source is a better route, even if there was a tool specifically for landscape architects. And I think let's not spoil ourselves like in thinking that there even should be like if I'm a graphic designer, like Photoshop is not made for me. It's made for like a whole number of professionals. Illustrator is not made for me as a graphic designer. It's made for a whole suite of professionals. So I think it's a bit maybe the wrong attitude to think as a discipline like, oh, we need this type of program, where many disciplines even in the greatest efficacy of co-adopted programs that weren't designed for them. Like I believe that Rhino's original origin is a jewelry design program, and like architects, everyone uses Rhino. So I think you'll be quicker to get to where you're going by adopting kind of like, oh, I'm just going to use it the way I want to use it, versus waiting for a specific program to drop for you.
So I've got a question here from the director of the school, Dorothea Imbert. She says, she's wondering if you privilege a more kind of bare bones technical look in your representation to kind of maybe tie into or support the kind of STEM aspects of landscape architecture, that there's an aesthetic behind the kind of choices, the really restrained choices that you make in your representation.
I don't know. That's a hard one. I would say it depends on what kind of graphic. I think, if you get me in like illustrative mode, or if you've seen illustratives that I've done in the past, they're full of, I would say, full of fluff and full of vibrancy that you would see in other people's graphics. But I think there is something to be said about that kind of style where you're trying to maybe not necessarily add the fanfare in some of these diagrams, because I think some of the stuff that is really impactful about the New York Times is like how cut and dry it is. It's like, when you see like displacement and you're seeing like the massive dots like move, or just like the example that I showed where you're talking about poverty and you're seeing just a mass of dots. There's something about like that recognition that does something to us as human beings in the way we perceive it. And I think, the at the end of the day, like I said, expression is comprehension. I really don't care what it really looks like for the pure look and aesthetics of it. It's more about 9 out of 10 people better get this. And if 9 out of 10 people don't get it, who cares if it looks pretty? Because 9 out of 10 people didn't get it, Yeah.
Well, I mean, that reminds me, thank you for bringing us back to this, because what you said there, that, you're humanizing data, and then you put up all those dots and you're like, these are actual people. And I think that that's really powerful. It's something that is, it speaks to the scale that landscape architects work at, where you can recognize the individual and say that, okay, these aren't statistics. We're not in the realm of abstract policy, but we're talking about actual people here. So I thought that was incredibly powerful. I wanted to note it. I've gotten a few questions from students, from Emily Loomis and from Dante Cruz, about the Kingsbury site specifically. They want to know what the origin, how that site got chosen as the kind of object of design, and what the ultimate kind of goal of the concentration on this site would be.
So the goal is to turn that into a nature reserve or publicly accessible parkland. Right now, it's nothing. It's just land. It's concentrated tree canopy in on the fringes, but largely it's just unprogrammed open space. I'll be working in concert with the CDC there, Burton Bell Carr, but also with a studio or 2 studios in Cornell, led by Mitch Glass, looking at the site, and hopefully in concert with those studios, or not even hopefully, in concert with those studios at the end of the semester, there'll be a report that could potentially be used to either create more fundraising graphics or literature or what have you, to actually start a campaign and go forward with community engagement and getting to the site where it needs to be. I mean, there's so much history there. Like it's not just, the history of public housing projects to the south, the racial component of vandalism, the burning of the Sideway Bridge. You have the adjacency to the Cuyahoga River and the environmental protection movement, and subsequent dumping and things like that. You have a ton of stuff there. The site is I think, and also one tract of land to the bottom is called Marion Motley Field, and which is named after the first, I believe he's the first African American player in the NFL Hall of Fame that used to play for the Cleveland Browns. So it's like, I mean, it is a plethora of rich history and context that, you know, when peeled back and orchestrated well, could be a gem for the city. And because of the size of it, will automatically rank within the top 10 of largest green spaces within Cleveland if made into a publicly accessible green space. So, I mean, it'll be a huge win for the city, not just for, you know, the social and contextual things that I've named, but then also just being like a pure, huge amenity for those residents.
So it is tremendous that image, that bridge that became the kind of target of vandalism and destruction. That's also a powerful image, the remnants of that bridge, and then the way that it affected the dynamics of the neighborhood around it. Really kind of stunning, and it fits in with, I think, one of the things we wanted to talk about, which was the centrality of narrative, the importance of being able to tell stories, or to unearth these stories, or make these stories kind of present. So I'm curious here, as we're kind of wrapping up, I want to ask you about one of the things you said at the beginning of your talk, which is that equity, social equity, has a relationship, a very close relationship to environmental resilience, that they're allied concepts. Now, I'm not sure that everyone, you know, in the public kind of believes that or even kind of realizes that. So I'm curious about what the major barriers are for those two narratives to be seen as working together. And what are your kind of ideas about how to raise the consciousness of that, you know, that social equity, racial equity is really an environmental concern as well, importantly?
Yeah, I think you know, I'm an immigrant to the United States, so I have I'm an American citizen, but I think it's important to note that I'm an immigrant to the United States because of how I view this topic, because I consider myself you know, an American. And I think, you know, the social ills that we face in America, I think sometimes when you're talking about specific groups, you're like, okay, this is this specific group's problem, but what it should be viewed in, and I think is ultimately should be the landscape architecture view, is that this is an American problem. This is everyone's problem. So, you know, when it's the old saying, you're only as strong as your weakest link. So if one socioeconomic group or group of people is not doing well, the entire whole of the country can't be functioning in its highest capacity. And I think if you are really going for, you know, the American dream, the American ideal, is that the entire country is functioning at its highest capacity, or entire city is functioning at its highest capacity. And it can't be if a piece of it is not functioning well. And I think just from that lens, you can start to paint the picture that, again, you know, if the whole is not functioning, or if a piece of the whole is not functioning, then the whole is not functioning together. And I think, you know, you have to just look at, I believe, just strong case studies. I think, you know, areas where I would say parks, public space, civic amenities do really well. You can say that sometimes it's really the effect of major organizations like, you know, Friends of Parks, or, you know, maintenance organizations. But I think it's not just about maintenance, it's about stewardship. So the idea that social cohesion breeds stewardship. So like, people care about the space. You know, whether that's my trash that I put there, I'm going to pick it up because this is my park, and it belongs to my community. And that's how you know, again, get the environmental justice part in there, because people care about the environment because it belongs to them. It has a specific bond to their being, you know, like whether, you know, they go there to play with their kids, whether, you know, they they play with their friends there. Whether you even get married in a space. Like, I've seen wedding pictures at Dilworth Park in Philadelphia. Like, the landscape can play, this malleable role in people's lives in a number of ways. So I think, you start at, kind of this overarching thing that it's everyone's problem. And then from there, you say that, like, if we fix this problem together, it'll benefit everybody, and, kind of work your way from that. But I think you got to start, with the larger concepts that, these social issues are important to everyone, not just the groups that they affect.
Well, thanks so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you and seeing your work. Really inspiring conversation for our students and for my colleagues on the faculty. Thank you very much, Andrew Sargeant, for taking your time to be with us. For the rest of you viewers, you will be able to view this online at the same address, and to remind you to tune in again next week for our next speaker. Thanks again, Andrew, and for the rest of you, I'm John Davis, and good night and good luck.
See you guys. Thanks for having me.